hearts. Be always acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. What a lovely introduction from Mimsy. It's great to renew my friendship with her. She said she went to boarding school right next door to my church some time ago. We were just having a good time recalling what that was like in those days. Chris Garata has been terrific to me, welcoming me here, and so grateful to him for his great leadership in this renowned parish church with its important ministry for the whole country. You all are a very important community of faith for us. And how lovely to hear Kristen Lynch on the organ again. I used to get to hear her more frequently. And almost every Sunday night I could hear Gene Simmons. Nobody plays the penny whistle quite like that for that prelude we got to hear just a minute ago. There's so much richness in this place, and it's been a very moving experience for me to be back in Memphis, where terrific creativity and exciting ministry is going on all the time, it seems. Mimsy recalled that early time in my ministry. First day was actually September 10th, 2001. And everybody knew I had, when I arrived with some commitments, and I had a meeting in New York City September 11. So the idea was I would go in and make a presentation to the little girls in the elementary school at St. Mary's School across the street from the church. So I'd just go over there and tell a couple of funny stories so they would get to know me a little better. And I walked out of that little chapel time, lovely time, and there were a group of faculty and staff huddled around a small television that they had hastily plugged in and gotten a signal. And they were watching that loop of horrific events that we had all tuned into that day. And so we knew, of course, there weren't going to be any flights out that day, obviously. And I walked back across the street where the staff came together, and it really wasn't my doing. It's people like Tim McCormack, who's here, and Robbie McQuiston, and John Gaskell, and others people who we just asked ourselves, now what? What's the role of the church in a world that suddenly changed like this? And they are all the ones who sort of came up with the idea, well, we need to make sure everybody knows we're open for prayer, and that's where that banner came from. So I'm going to get back on the plane again here in just a little bit. I don't usually travel by air nearly as much as I used to, and things have certainly changed in airports. Maybe you've heard a story about these two men who found themselves sitting next to each other on the plane, fell into conversation about who they were and where they came from, and it turns out, lo and behold, one was a priest and the other a rabbi. And so in the interest of ecumenical understanding, they started sort of talking with each other about each other's traditions, and the priest turned to the rabbi and said, now, is it still the case that you have certain sort of dietary restrictions? I mean, you're supposed to stay away from things like pork and shellfish and things like that. And the priest said, well, yes, it is still part of our tradition, something we observe carefully. The priest nodded appreciatively, and after a little silence said again, well, forgive me if this feels like prying, but I'm just curious, have you ever crossed the line there? Have you ever done something you shouldn't do? Have you ever eaten some of that food? And the rabbi said, well, in fact, yes. One day I yielded to temptation and I tried a ham sandwich. The priest nodded understandingly. I mean, after all, we're all just human, aren't we? After some silence, the rabbi asked the priest, now, is it true in your tradition that you still aren't supposed to ever be married? Yes, that's true, the priest said. And he said, well, in fact, it's an important part of our tradition that priests are to remain celibate. The rabbi nodded and said, well, forgive me if this is prying, but have you ever crossed the line? And the priest admitted, well, yes. One time I fell in love with a woman, and yes, the truth is I broke the rule. The rabbi was, of course, understanding. They were just caring for each other in that moment, and the rabbi then later, after some pregnant pause, leaned over and said to the priest, beats the heck out of a ham sandwich, doesn't it? So I'm heading back out to the airport today on my way home to Richmond, and I've noticed in airports something that I guess I noticed at first when it started happening, but I stopped noticing until recently, started flying again. I just don't travel that much. And that is this, as I'm waiting for a connecting flight, this continuous loop that plays in airports. A recorded message. Attention, passengers. Keep a close eye on your luggage. Do not accept anything from strangers. Report any suspicious activity to the nearest security personnel. Have a good flight. Over and over this plays, and I had just started to tune it out, and yet it's part of our experience now, and it almost feels to me like a kind of metaphor for life in this post-9/11 world in which we're living. A kind of simmering suspicion. A need to watch out. Somebody might be out to get you. This is leading to some real stress, simmering kind of stress on the surface of our lives, anxiety, and even anger, kind of increasing polarization as we are increasingly suspicious of what's happening around us and in our lives. But you and I, we come to places like Calvary Church, Church of the Holy Communion, our various faith communities across the city. We come because we believe it's possible to tune into a different voice. For so much of our lives on the surface, we're dialed into this frequency that's communicating fear and anger, suspicion, revenge, anxiety. But we come to places like Calvary because we believe deeply that beneath all of that, it's possible for human beings to attune themselves to a truer voice, to a frequency where prophets and angels and archangels and God Himself continue to speak a very different message. I love you. Pay attention. You're only traveling through this way for a short time. A lot of you are carrying a lot more luggage than you need to carry. I made you with everything you need. Keep a close eye on your spouses, your children, your neighbor, and the strangers, and love them the way I love you. A whole different kind of voice speaking in the deeper places of our hearts. A continuous voice, as Thomas Kelly once wrote, a great Quaker writer, to which we may continually return in prayer. The slumbering Christ in all of us, just waiting to be stirred into life again in our bodies, clothed in our flesh. Over the last few hours, a number of people have been asking me around Memphis, and certainly back at my old wonderful parish, Church of the Holy Communion, what do you think the future of the Episcopal Church is going to be? And I've been drawn to remember something that one of the great deans at Cambridge University, H.A. Williams, the dean of Trinity College, Cambridge, said. H.A. Williams was made famous back in the 1950s for a book he wrote called True Wilderness. He vowed in that book that he would no longer speak about or write about or preach about anything he did not know from personal experience. No more abstract theology, no more speculation about church doctrine and dogma. No, he would only talk about what he knew of God from his day-to-day life, what he can attest to as true from his experience. That alone is instruction for the church, but it happened that at the time of his death, just a few years ago, there were discovered in his desk a bunch of papers that were intended to be his final book. It was just published not long ago, and in it, H.A. Williams said that the church of the future, 100 years from now, the only churches that will survive, that will still be in business, will be those churches that have become schools and centers of contemplation and meditation, teaching people classical ways to access the deepest truths of our lives, to have true experiences of God themselves, individually and collectively, and thus to be empowered to live their lives. But it must be true experience. And so the only churches that will be in business will be those that are teaching contemplation. And I have to say, in my own parish church, one of the most popular programs we offer is something called mindfulness-based stress reduction. And I'm sure in part it's a way of kind of tending to this simmering anxiety and stress that many of us experience in this post-9/11 world. But it's also, if it's connected to ancient Christian tradition, giving us access to that deeper, truer frequency where God is continually reminding you of your true life. Could it be that this is what Jesus meant when he said to Martha, "Martha, Martha, you're fretting and fussing about many things, but only one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the best part, and it shall not be taken away from her." Is that what Jesus meant? That it'll always be available to you and to me, if only we would return to it. But I'm not sure anything could be more countercultural in our modern multitasking world. I rarely see people in Richmond, Virginia, driving without a cell phone at the same time. Some of you a few months ago may have seen a picture on the front page of the New York Times. It was a Sunday New York Times. And it showed a great press of crowds in the gallery of the Louvre where the Mona Lisa is hanging. Maybe some of you saw this. And this is a typical crowd on any given day in the Louvre, and a number of the people were all pushed up. Many couldn't see the Mona Lisa, so they had their cell phones all held up high, many of them taking pictures, and a few of them getting a selfie with the Mona Lisa. And the idea is then to quickly do an Instagram or post it on Facebook, and then move on to the next great masterpiece, the Venus de Milo or something in the Louvre, and do the same thing, It happens every day. 8 million visitors a year, 35,000 masterpieces in the Louvre. If you were to spend 60 seconds in front of every one of the masterpieces there, you would be there continuously, 24 hours a day, for over a month. And so clearly no one can do that, so everyone does the same thing. You make your bucket list, and you quickly move from one to the other in this great press of crowds. The article, though, wasn't about the Louvre. That was just an illustration. It was about a psychologist at the University of Pennsylvania who's doing an experiment. He's been doing it for years now, about a very different way of being present in an art museum. This psychologist takes his subjects and tells them, all right, you'll have about an hour here in the Barnes Museum, the Barnes Foundation. Some of you have been there. It's a chock full of beautiful paintings and other works of art. You'll have about an hour, and so what I'll ask you to do is for the first 30 minutes or so, just wander around the gallery and take in the room and try to get a sense, is there a particular work of art that's calling out to you, that's sort of beckoning to you, something you feel drawn to sit with? And then, after you've taken a sense of the room, go back, sit in front of that one piece for at least 20 minutes and see what it has to tell you. One of his subjects in this experiment was a particularly skeptical nurse. She admitted she's a sort of left-brain person who's very analytical, and she thought this was just a little too fuzzy for her and wasn't sure that she could buy into it completely. But she decided she'd play by the rules, and she wandered around the gallery and finally discovered that, yes, there was this one painting that was calling out to her. A Montrouge, Rosa La Rouge, it's called, by Toulouse-Lautrec. It's a painting, a portrait of a prostitute. And so she ended up sitting herself in front of Rosa La Rouge and pondering this woman's life. She found herself wondering why this woman looked so unhappy with her life. Why the severe aspect? She came up with all sorts of ideas about why this might be, and then in the midst of it all, concocting a sort of narrative of the woman's life, she noticed that Toulouse-Lautrec had painted a little window just over the shoulder of the prostitute. A way out, or a way in perhaps to her true life. The experience for the nurse was so profound. Here's what she said about it. It changed my life. And she bought a print of that Toulouse-Lautrec woman to take home with her to ponder more in the days, weeks ahead, because she said, I knew she had more to teach me. I knew she had more to teach me. What a difference. The difference between running from one gallery to the next, getting your Instagram sent. The UPenn psychologist says his experiments have yielded one important insight, that people who are moving quickly from one thing to the next in an art museum, they come out of a 2 to 3 hour experience in an art museum depleted, tired, very hungry, exhausted, and quite often cranky, upset even with the people they've gone to the museum with. But people who enter in the way he's proposing come out of such an experience in the art museum rejuvenated, enlivened, somehow newly engaged with the companions with whom they've gone to the gallery. A whole new way of being in the world. I don't have to tell you that we're going through a time where we're having to learn how to be in the world again as spouses come home from busy days at work so exhausted that all they can say to each other is, what are we going to do for dinner? Parents talking on their cell phones or texting while their children are tugging at their skirt tails or coat tails, trying to get their attention. Every day it's as if you and I, we're surrounded by masterpieces. I mean, there's the beauty and wonder of creation on the one hand. But there's that crowning piece of God's creation, His ultimate masterpiece. And that's the person sitting right next to you and the people all around you, the people you'll pass on the street today, the people you'll go home to tonight. It's as if we're wandering from gallery to gallery, but never quite taking in the extreme wonder of all that we're in the midst of. Recently, I read an interesting little story about a grocery store cashier. She spent her whole life, her whole working life, simply ringing up and bagging groceries every day. Her life was simple. She occupied very little space on the planet. She moved in very tight circles. I'm sure she never went to the Louvre, for example, but she would go from her apartment to the bus, to the grocery store, and back home again every day. The peculiar thing about this woman is that she arrived at work animated. She was so excited to see her customers again. She learned their names over time. And as she was bagging their groceries, she always asked them about their lives. So how is your spouse? Tell me about your child in school. Or how did that operation go? And as she put the last pieces of groceries in the person's bag, she always said, remember, I'm praying for you, honey. Remember, I'm praying for you. Well, this was both a wonderful thing and a very difficult thing for the grocery store because everyone wanted to get in her checkout line. No one would get in any other. And so the line would snake all the way back into the grocery store, and they didn't care. It was worth the wait. And at the woman's funeral, the church was packed with people who wanted to give testimonials about how this grocery store cashier had changed their lives. She changed my life. Now, the most interesting thing about this story is that I read about it in an academic book, a weighty tome by a professor at UVA named James Davison Hunter. He was writing, he entitled the book, To Change the World. I wrote down the full. The subtitle is The Irony, Tragedy, and Possibility of Christianity in the Late Modern World. It's a big. He had to prove himself to his academic peers. And so for the first 2/3 of the book, he surveyed all of the great Christian movements that tried in vain to somehow change the world through political action, social action, and the like. And he concluded by saying, the way Christians can most effectively change the world is through something he called faithful presence. Being present again in your life, re-inhabiting your soul, dialing into that deeper voice that's continually speaking in you so that you become clothed with the Christ. I take it to mean he's saying something like that voice which is continually playing, do not worry about your life. I am with you. You have all you need. Keep a close eye on each other and love each other the way I loved you. You're walking among my masterpieces every day, too wonderful and numerous to count. And these masterpieces, none of them have do not touch signs on them. In fact, these masterpieces that you're seeing every day, they are there for you to love, for you to hug and kiss, for you to feed and care for, to clothe. You know, I like when all was said and done and we were all wringing our hands at 9/11 and wondering, what are we going to say to our children? That was the big topic around the church and school that day. What are we going to say when they come home? I ended up liking what Mr. Rogers said. Mr. Rogers said, you know, when something terrible happens like this, just as you're watching these terrible images, always keep your eye out for the helpers, because they're always there. The ambulance drivers, the firemen, the fellow office workers and colleagues who are hugging each other and helping each other. It's the helpers. God's all over this thing. And then pay attention to these feelings you're having in yourself, these feelings of love for these people, and this prompting to pray. That's God in you. Pay attention to that. Attune yourself to this deeper frequency. Look for the helpers. Be like the grocery store cashier, so that when the world wants to know, where is God? They point to people like that cashier and people like you and me. Let us stand for a closing prayer.